All right. Well, welcome to The Big Idea. My name is Julie Mulvihill, and I am the Executive Director of Humanities Kansas. Welcome back for those of you who joined us for the monthly Big Idea topics last year. We're happy to be started up again here in January. The Big Idea, for those of you who are new to the program, it's an online program and it's intended to highlight and inspire fresh thinking in humanities scholarship. And we're just so excited by today's presentation. So just one housekeeping duty for you to keep in mind. We welcome your questions throughout today's presentation, and you can type them in either the chat box or the Q&A box, whichever you prefer. We'll be checking them throughout the presentation and trying to add them into the conversation between Valerie and Sherri. Now, today's Big Idea explores African-American genealogy in Kansas with Sherri Camp, and each Big Idea begins a week or so in advance of today's conversation with a short essay that's written by our featured speaker that includes additional resources like films or books and articles that you can use to spark a conversation among your own friends and family, maybe over the dinner table or over coffee. And we hope that this Big Idea continues on beyond today's Zoom. So to begin, I'd like to introduce Dr. Valerie Mendoza, who serves as our moderator for the program. She will introduce and interview our special guest. Dr. Mendoza is Director of Title III Strengthening Institutions Grant at Washburn University, and she's a native Kansan and earned a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley. So welcome, Valerie. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Julie. Welcome, everyone. We're super excited you're here, and it is my pleasure to introduce Sherri Camp. She teaches genealogy and history and is the author of African American Topeka, a book on 150 years of African American history in Topeka, Kansas. Welcome, Sherri.
Hi, and thank you for having me.
So let's get started. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be a genealogist, right? So in your Big Idea, you mentioned Roots by Alex Haley. Did he serve as an inspiration for you?
You know what? I have to say, no, not exactly. So I have a couple of things I'm going to share with you real quick. This person right here is the person who inspired me. This is my great-grandmother. We call her Grandma Frida. She was living when I started doing genealogy, and so I started to interview her. And over again, I would research what she told me, get some information, go back and ask her more questions and go back and forth until I've gotten, enough, at least enough to start building my tree, which means gathering the names. Gathering the names
awesome.
and the places. And so that was the main thing that I did. However, one of the things that I often say is, and I don't know if this is going to work this way. Let's see, I'm going to stop sharing that. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Roots. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Roots. I often say, specifically when I'm teaching class, my family didn't pass down the story of the family from generation to generation like Kunta Kinte did. And this is a monument that's in Atlanta of Kunta Kinte and his child. And I don't know if you know the story in Roots where he tells his child the family story and just passes it on from generation to generation that way, which is pretty cool, but that's not what happened for me.
So tell us a little bit about that. So when you talked to your great-grandmother, which I think is amazing, and so what were some of the family stories that she helped you uncover that led you to research more of your family history, and how did you uncover those stories?
Well, so it's not what she told me, it's what she didn't tell me, which was a lot.
Yeah.
So my genealogy literally starts with me doing genealogy. I had her, which is actually a blessing. And she told me her mother's name, and maybe her grandmother's name after I found it. I'm like, well, is this your grandma's name? And she says, oh yeah, that's it. She would tell me things like she was born and raised in Lawrence. She left there to go to be with her mother because I think she was with her grandmother, which is a story I'm still trying to trace down. And so there's just a lot she didn't say. And that's and so I'm a genealogist of the family. Everything that has been discovered past my grandmother, I found it. So people are literally, family members that are researching their family tree are literally collecting information that I put out there because I did all the work. And I've been doing it since the 80s.
That curiosity got sparked and you're like, I have to know more.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So anything of interest that you want to share with us that came from your research? Oh my
goodness. I have so many stories, Valerie. We would be here literally forever. I could talk the whole hour and you guys hopefully wouldn't get bored. Okay. So, one of the biggest stories that I have is my great grandmother. You know, one of the things that's most important about my family line, which is not a happy story, but it's just that I have all of these family members and we have children raised over generations, but I don't have fathers' names. They weren't in the picture for one reason or another. And I don't have all the reasons. I just don't know the stories. So I wanted to find a happy story. I wanted to find something that's successful, something that meant something and could be a happy story. It literally took me years. It wasn't until maybe 5 or 6 years ago that I actually found a story that was a happy story. So let me tell you how it worked. I was researching. I collected all the names, which people do. They collect the names, but the stories are the things that are harder to find. And you have to kind of piece it together by finding documents and other things that help you to learn more about that person. And I have some images that I can maybe show you later. But specifically, I was looking for her grandmother. So I got back to 1870, which is what you do when you're doing African-American genealogy. You get back to 1870, which is the first census that you will see freed enslaved people who were formerly enslaved. And so I got back that far, and that was her great-grandmother.
Okay.
And so her great-grandmother and great-grandfather. And I had that information for years and years and years. Couldn't get past 1870 because I didn't know where they had been enslaved.
Okay.
And I knew they were from Missouri, but that's all that I knew. So I was poring over the census records that I had, because I collected every census record for every time they appeared, and found that her grandma Frida, her great grandfather's name was Benjamin Fry. And I found that he had been in the military, which meant he was in the Civil War. And that was a big find because after I found the Civil War pension file, then I had a friend in DC go to the National Archives for me. And 365 images later, I found all the people she had been enslaved by. I found a stepsister or half-sister, and just all of this information that I'm still going through 365 images, okay? But what I found when I found her half-sister, I was able to put her in the tree. And then, because they shared a mom. So I found her death certificate, which had her mother's name on it, which my grandmother's great-grandmother didn't have.
Okay.
So that led me to a record in California, because the enslavers took my 5th great-grandmother now to California during the gold rush. Another story.
Oh my gosh.
And as she took a child with her. So there were 2 people that were enslaved that were taken to California. The daughter married in 1856, and her husband built an adobe house that still stands to this day.
Oh my
It's on the
gosh.
National Register of Historic Places. It's called the Sug House in California, Sonora, California. And it's a whole story, and it's something that I'm feeling like, okay, there's an accomplishment on that family line anyway. But so that's really what kind of drove me to continually search to find a happy story, and not just, you know, all the suffering and things that my family went through.
Yeah. So your story, wow, that's amazing. It brings up so many things, but and one of those things is that, you know, your big ideas about African American genealogy research in Kansas. So can you take us back a little bit, put on your historian hat, and tell us the why and the how and the when of African Americans coming to Kansas in the state's earliest days?
Yes. Okay. So first, you had people that came to Kansas who were enslaved. So everybody's familiar with 1854 and the Missouri Compromise, and how people were coming to Kansas to try to move the pendulum in one direction or another to make it either a free or a slave state. And so people came here that were enslaved. So that's one way they came. Another way they came here was as free people. So for instance, there's Anne Chatillon, who is in my book. Her name is Anne Davis Chatillon, which I believe there's like 3 or 4 or 5 spellings of that name, but I believe the actual name is Shoto. She married a man here in Kansas. She originally came enslaved, but she bought her freedom, and she is known as the first African American to be in Topeka in Shawnee County. So she came to Topeka free. She didn't necessarily come to Kansas free, but so that's one way. And then of course there are people who has escaped and came to Kansas because Kansas was freed land. It was the place where, you know, one of the things in Black culture is that if one Black person knows, everybody knows. So if somebody knew that you could be free in Kansas, everybody knew it and everybody was coming. So a specific story in 1862, between 1862 and 1863, the Missouri River froze and people came to Kansas across that river. They escaped in hundreds.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
And so they came through, and they came down through across Weston, Missouri. I think that's where it was the most shallow, to Leavenworth, and just populated from there. There's there was a large population of African Americans in Atchison, and and then a lot of people came down to through Lawrence, and then further south to Eskridge, Wabaunsee County, and they're just populated the area. So escaping was the one thing that they did, and they also came through the Underground Railroad. There are people that were sheltered and literally helped to escape through the Underground Railroad. And I think a lot of you may already know that story or know some of that story. And we know that the Lane Trail, Highway 75, took them from Topeka north. And then, of course, the Exodus in 1879 and 1880. And I think I wanted to show you a picture of that. Some of these things, of course, are in my book. And yeah, so one of my favorite people in the Exodus is Pap Singleton. And the reason why he's such a big deal to me is because of this picture right here. I'm going to show you, excuse me just a second.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so this is after the Civil War, when freed men and women are coming to Kansas. Oh my gosh. Yeah,
I really like this picture. I kind of call it like the first Photoshop. You can see that Pap Singleton here on the right and this gentleman on the left were superimposed onto this. So they came, they walked, they came by boat, they came by train, but they came. And of course, there were lots and lots of African Americans in Kansas and specifically in Topeka during the Exodus. And the reason why they came to Kansas, specifically the Exodus, which I think is a really important point to make, is because there was a convention in 1878. They called it the Negro Convention in Nashville, Tennessee, and they they had to decide, or I guess the point was to decide whether they should stay in the South or whether they should leave. And of course, there were so many atrocities. There were lynchings and of course, Jim Crow and all of the things that were oppressing African Americans. So they chose, and it's quite a long proceedings. It's printed. I mean, it's publicized. The proceedings are publicized, where you can read what they were saying and how they felt about it. And of course, the decision at the end of the proceedings was to leave, and that's really the impetus for the exodus to Kansas.
Oh my gosh.
In addition to the fact that Pap Singleton had come here years before and had scouted out areas and had colonies he had started.
Wow, I did not know that about the convention in Tennessee. That is really interesting. So in your essay and in your when you were sharing with us about your own family genealogy, one of the things that stands out is your persistence in uncovering your story, but also the difficulties with African American genealogy in particular. So can you talk a little bit about that? And then you also in your essay mentioned, this idea, this desire to want to forget a painful past, right? Which I think we can all, relate to at some point in our own personal stories.
Okay, so let's start at the end and then we'll work our way back to the beginning. So that's some of the things that I kind of discovered as I was going along and as I was researching my grandmother's family. The story of slavery is just pervasive. It doesn't go away because people have become free. It is part of life even to this day. And there's several authors that actually discuss that. Dr. Joy DeGruy, in fact, talks about post-traumatic slave disorder syndrome, she calls it, where there is just something that persists. So in my imaginations, in my family line, where we don't have males that are part of the family, I imagine that there were people who were torn apart, families that were torn apart and weren't allowed to be families. I know that to be true in one family line, one specific person, because when she was married, she had 2 children, and she and her children were taken to another place, were sold and taken to another place. And I have the bill of sale from that pension file that I was telling you about. They interviewed the enslaver, and they literally wrote in the testimony, the bill of sale, and it says that she was taken away. And that was literally considered divorce because they were not necessarily able to be seen again because they were no longer in the same place. So the point of it is when you have things like this happen, you have, it's caused trauma. And in my estimation of things, in my imaginations, it just went from generation to generation to generation. And maybe not just starting there, because her mother, the one that I'm telling you about, was taken to California. And the rest of the children were not. One was, but the rest were not. They were sold otherwise. So this kind of trauma, in my estimation, is what just kept going from generation to generation, and things just kept repeating themselves. And so that is kind of the thing that I think is the most hard to deal with and caused a lot of grief. But back to the first part of your question, which was doing genealogy.
Yeah, the difficulties. But just before you get back to that, I mean, just in hearing those stories, right? It's just my empathy is like, I'm almost have tears in my eyes,
I know, me
thinking
too.
about, separated families like that. But so then how does that make finding the genealogy and the paperwork difficult? What kind of obstacles?
So that's the biggest problem, and that's why I do genealogy today. Because the information still eludes me. There are still people that elude me. The only way for me to know the truth is for someone to document it. So for instance, my great-grandmother, Grandma Frida, her grandmother put on her, somehow someone knew that her father's name was X, and it's on the death certificate. So somehow I have that piece of information. I still have to prove it, but the point is that the only way for me to know is if they put it in a document somewhere. So my job is to scour every document I can find everywhere. And the key here is that there are lots of documents that tell the story. And so that's what I've been doing lately. I've been using Google Maps to map out addresses. I've been using city directories to find where people were and what their occupation was over time. And all of these things literally tell stories. I was really quite surprised in using Google Maps to plot all the addresses and see exactly where they were. And they were all literally over time, multiple family members were in this 1 square mile.
Wow.
And that tells a whole story of its own. So now I can go look at the local history and see what was happening in that 1 square mile over time, which will help tell the story of their life, along with, of course, newspaper articles and different things like that.
Wow, that's amazing. So, you teach this, right? You teach other people how to do genealogy, and you help them uncover their stories. And you know, in your essay, you spoke about, stories of resilience and determination. So, can you give us an example of something that you helped to uncover?
Help to uncover. I want to tell you a couple of stories. To help to uncover, that's another ball of wax.
Okay,
but
well, go ahead and
let me tell you a couple of stories about Topeka specifically. So Anne Chatillon was free. She was born free, and she lived in Illinois, and she was stolen and taken through to various states and ended up in Kansas. And once she was able to sell, she became a business person. She was I'm trying to think of I can't think of what it was she was selling, but she was able to buy her own freedom, and she had a tavern or something like that, more of an outpost north of town. And her and her husband then, when she got married, bought property and became, property owners, and so on and so forth. The point is that here this girl is traumatized and stolen from her family as a child and sold over and over again. Of course, it was a little bit hard for them to sell her because they didn't have paperwork for her. So that's why they allowed her to actually work for herself and buy her freedom, which is still kind of dubious. But the point is, her life changed. She was able to go from trauma to success, have a family, and so on. And she actually, she was interviewed, and there's an interview printed of her, because I think she lived for quite a while. That's one story. Some of the other stories wrap around specifically Topeka and the fact that Lincoln College became Washburn University, and educated quite a few African Americans in law specifically, and how that changed the trajectory of their lives. Specifically, there were people not only that went to law school here, but people that came here as lawyers that created businesses. And, you know, we talk about 4th Street and how important it was. There were doctors and lawyers and dentists and all kinds of all successful people who didn't start out that way, but became that way. And as a result of being in Kansas and seeing Kansas as a place where they could thrive, where it just made a difference in their lives.
Yeah. So we've talked about how, you know, it's hard to uncover these stories because they didn't preserve, you know, their histories, or there might be stories that they didn't want to remember and tell. So what advice would you have for those of us who want to preserve our own stories or recent family histories for future generations?
Okay, so I'm going to take you to the beginning. The first thing you want to do is interview your family members before it's too late. Interview not just the older people in your family, the elders, but also interview your brothers and sisters, your cousins, your aunts and uncles. You'd be surprised. I have a story I tell. My brother, so I have this favorite uncle, which was my great-grandmother's son. And I just loved him. Whenever he came to town, he brought us candy, he brought us gifts and toys. And it was just, he was my favorite uncle for that reason, of course. So my brother and I were discussing him one day, and he was telling me stories that I didn't know, that I had no privy to. And so you never know what someone else knows that you don't. So it's a good idea to discuss your family members with other family members and find out what you can glean from there. And of course, document that. That's one thing. So you start to build your tree, you know, you put down the names and dates of yourself, your children, your spouse, his family, your parents, grandparents, and so on. But the other part of that is to then start to collect all the documents. Now, we used to do this in the old days by paper. And now we do it online. And so the key to doing it online preserves it in the first place. So all those stories you want to make sure you collect, you want to put them online. There's so many different ways that you can creatively share it. You can write a story, you can write a poem. Some people write songs, you can create cookbook, you can do digital scrapbooking, which is one of my favorites. And I do a class on that, and I'm planning to do a class later this year on that here at the public library. But there's just so many ways. The first thing, though, is just to preserve the names of your family and make sure you have them in an online. So Family Search does it for free, allows you to build your tree for free. Ancestry lets you build it for free. You can't search there for free, but you can build your tree. There are quite a few other places people build their trees on to be able to have them digitally and also have them last, you know, for a long time. But that's what I encourage everyone to do, is not only to build your tree, but also to collect the documents that preserve your family's information and prove your family's information.
Oh, that's great. So I recently started watching Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr. on PBS. And I know I'm late to the party. This show is so fascinating to me. So what influence do you think that this show has had on, you know, our interest in genealogy? You know, do you think this kind of revived that interest, or do you watch it? Or...
Absolutely. You know, we have watch parties. And we discuss the stories. But one of the things that you need to know about the Finding Your Roots is the last iteration of his. He started with, let's see, he interviewed Oprah Winfrey was one of the first people he interviewed, and he did her family tree and told her story and found that in true fashion of genealogy, what you'll learn is that history does repeat itself. So she was into education, and he found that her great-grandfather had built a school. So that, was a big deal.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
So I was happy to see him when he started with Oprah. And this has been, wow, lots of years ago now. But it got people interested in family history. It got them interested in, so there's quite a few organizations and quite a few genealogists that have become professionals to help people because, more people are interested.
Yeah. And, I've been keeping an unofficial tally of sources that you've mentioned that you've used for our audience. They want to start, looking up their family tree. And I know there are way more than this, and you can add to this. So far you've talked about using Google Maps, city directories, the census, military records. What other good sources can you point us to?
There are all kinds. Don't forget the newspapers. Obituaries usually appear in the newspaper. That's one of the first things you're going to want to find when you're looking for a person.
Yeah.
Birth and death and marriage certificates, of course. I'm looking at my notes here. So one of the things about, let me just mention a couple more. I found a Native American census roll for one of my family members. They were rejected, but guess what? It told me who their enslaver was and who their parents were.
Oh.
And so even if a record doesn't have the information you want to have on it, it still can give you information on your family member. Wills, court records. There is a myriad of court records, and you never know what you might find there. Land records. I could just go on and on. There are so many different kinds of records, but all of these records over time tell what's happening in a family.
Yeah. So I just want to remind our audience, if you have a question, please type it in the chat or the Q&A. So tell us about, by the way, if you want to watch Finding Your Roots, if you're somebody who hasn't, Tuesdays at 7 Central.
On PBS.
Yes, on PBS. Tell us about both the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society and the Kansas Network to Freedom, and how can one get involved in either of those?
Let's start with the Kansas Network to Freedom. Actually, in 2010, we formed the Kansas Network to Freedom to put on the Underground Railroad Conference, which is a national conference that was brought to Topeka. We have since disbanded, but what we did was pull together a lot of Underground Railroad sites in the area of Kansas. So that's still a really great thing to see. What I wanted to do was show, there's a map. If you go to the Network to Freedom, which is a National Park Service website, you'll see all of the areas in Kansas and around the country that are deemed Network to Freedom sites. And it's an application process, and you have to be approved. And so we have several here in Topeka, and there are a lot around Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa and so forth and so on. But that group has since disbanded. But
that's really cool that those sites were documented and live on in digital space. Absolutely.
When we had the conference in Kansas, they said there's no Underground Railroad in Kansas. Like, not true. So that was pretty cool. But when it comes to the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, we call it AAHGS, AAHGS. It's been around since 1977. In fact, our founder, James Dent Walker, wanted to join the National Genealogical Society. And at that time, like in the 60s and 70s, they said, no, this is not a place. We don't share anything in common. And he, at that point, was an archivist at the National Archives and was an expert in military records. And so He tried several times after that and was rejected, but decided to create his own genealogy society.
Good for
And it
him.
was founded in 1977 in Washington, D.C. Now we have over 30 chapters around the country, and we have one here in Topeka, in Kansas, the Kansas OGS, or we call it COGS. KAAHDS. You can find it on the web at cogs.org, and then the National Society at ogs.org or aahds.org. We literally help people figure out how to do their family history. We have speakers throughout the Kansas chapter, has speakers throughout the year. And of course, we have a national conference in October every year, the second week usually. And it's been virtual for the last 3 years, but once you join, you can have access to the whole network, which includes a journal, newsletters, and all of the chapters and all of the people who can help you find your family history throughout the country.
Awesome. So we're getting some questions in. So
Okay.
one is, what are the best ways to verify your lineage, especially if it appears through your digital family tree that you have quote unquote royal British ancestry?
So it's the same each time you do it. It's always the same. You start with yourself. You work your way incrementally backwards. So you have to prove each generation by having documentation. And in genealogy, we have something called GPS, which is a genealogical proof standard. You have to have at least 3 pieces of information that document each idea that you have. For instance, if you have a person's name or their birth date or place or death date or place, you have to have 3 pieces of information that corroborate that. And so you do that for every generation. A lot of people will get, like for instance, Family Search is a website that has one tree. So if you get plugged into the tree, you start putting your people in and you find your information's already there, it could pull you all the way back to Adam, literally. But what you have to do is go through and make sure that each generation is documented and proven before you go to the next generation. So for instance, say like I did my great-grandmother, and I put her name in there, and somebody else has done the work and it's taken back 4 or 5 more generations. I'm going to start with my great-grandmother, prove her parents, then prove their parents, and so on and so forth. So you can't just say, oh, my work is done, or it's all done for me and it's all correct, because it's not necessarily the truth.
And then proving that would be using some of those sources that we talked about earlier. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
And there are compiled sources too that are very helpful, and you'd be surprised at what you can find in repositories. There are all kinds of things that you wouldn't think of that are places where you might find information, historical societies, libraries, all kinds of repositories that may have information that you didn't know.
Yeah.
You don't. Mm-hmm.
And we have some people here on the call from various counties in Kansas who are letting us know about their collections. So thank you. So another question for you. In studying my family history, I also learn so much about how my family has shaped me and my children. Are there memoirs written by genealogists who explore this family history and history of self? And if so, do you have a favorite?
Memoirs. My family doesn't have any. I do have an 1856 letter that my 5th grade grandmother wrote to her daughter. So that's cool, but I don't have any memoirs specifically in my family tree. What I do is here at the library collect family histories, because you never know where you might find a piece of information. You can interlibrary loan them if you are looking for them. You can are looking for a specific family. There are all types. There's some that are typewritten. There's some that are bound spiral. There's some that are hardbound. There's some that are this thick with multiple volumes. So you might want to look for your family in a book also. So Family Search is really the best place to do that, because they collect family histories also, and you never know if your family has one.
Yeah. So here's another question for you. With the decline of newspapers, there are fewer obituaries and birth announcements, wedding announcements, those types of things being published. How do you see this as impacting genealogy?
Ooh, good question. And of course it does impact us quite a bit. However, one of the things specifically when it comes to obituaries, I think it's pretty cool that funeral homes are now having their obituaries online. I don't know that it'll last forever, because the bandwidth is not going to be there forever. Of course, there was a day when you could only, reserve, so much information on a floppy disk. And now we have, online storage. So you never know exactly how things can be stored over time. So my idea is that it's best to collect it early, number one. Number two, if you come across your information, for instance, there's a website called Find a Grave that people are using to not only document the cemetery where a person's buried, maybe a headstone. They're literally putting all the family information in those two, and connecting families. That's another way. But I always tell people, if you can't get to the internet, if you if you don't have electricity, you can't get to your computer, have a hard copy, have it in multiple places, save your family information on a flash drive or whatever you deem is best, and have it in other places, because natural disasters can take out your information. So save it with your family members, have multiple copies everywhere. So yes, I believe that it is a problem with being able to have that information the same way, but there are other ways to preserve it.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Do you have recommendations for sources when trying to track exodusters back to their Southern origins? We know it's an uphill battle when finding enslaved records, but anything from emancipation that might help? Is there any, like a go?
There are all kinds of things. Okay, so first of all, the Freedmen's Bureau records are a gold mine if your family's in it. My family has not been. There are Freedmen Bank records. There are all kinds of things. And what's happening everywhere is people are compiling information. For instance, I found my fourth great grandfather. Nope, I'm going to say he's my fifth great grandfather in a book. He was in Mississippi. He was he was a representative of the county or the state representative or something like that. And so he was in a book. I'm like, okay, that told his story, or told another part of his story. And so that was during the Reconstruction period. So the key is, and it's always going to be the same, is you have to start with where you are and work incrementally backwards. You have to have someone today that you can, or at a specific period of time. So for instance, if you have exodusters whose names you have to incrementally go backwards to find their family members. It's going to always be the same, because you can't jump from here to enslaved times, or on the other side of slavery, to tell their story. You have to work incrementally backwards, specifically in order to prove it.
Sherri, thank you so much. This time has just flown by. We are so
Yes.
grateful that you could join us. I learned
Thank
so
you.
much.
Yes, let me echo my gratitude, Sherri. You just really opened our eyes to so many resources that people might be able to use to help uncover their own family history. And also, I know that you have inspired others who haven't started on this journey to maybe begin it as well. And you've certainly given everyone food for thought as we think about the privilege that we have of knowing our family stories and where we come from, and to potentially have the vision to think about where we want to go. So my great thanks to you, Sherri, and of course, Valerie, you did a terrific job moderating the conversation. I know we could have gone on and on and on. The questions and thank yous are still coming in the chat box, I see. But with that, we're going to adjourn. And I just want to encourage everybody to watch their inbox and their social media from Humanities Kansas. And we'll announce next month's big idea here in the upcoming weeks. So thanks, everyone. We appreciate you.
Thank you.